You can open up to Mark chapter 5. I'm in Ephesians 5, but we're going to start in Mark 5. There it is. We'll be picking up around verse 35. We're finishing up tonight, looking at the account of Jesus raising the daughter of Jairus, and that is interspersed with him working this other miracle, which we talked about in more depth last week, healing this woman who had a flow of blood for a dozen years. But we'll find the conclusion to this miracle here in chapter 5 and then move on into at least the first section of chapter 6 tonight, looking at the Gospel of Mark. Glad that you're with us tonight. Always a pleasure to be with you, and have really been enjoying this study together of the life of Jesus. So we'll continue with it here in just a few moments. Let's pray together before we get any further in. Holy God, we're thankful for the time we have tonight. We're thankful for those who are here to study with us, and we pray that you would be with each one of us. Bless us with wisdom, with a desire to learn more about who Jesus was and what he did and what he can do. Help us to increase in our love for him and our love for each other. We're thankful that we can build our faith together in times such as these, and we ask your blessings in all areas of our lives. We know that we need you. We know that we can do nothing good without you. We pray that you'd equip us to do just that. Thank you for the time we have now. Be with us all is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. All right, well, last week we saw really the main theme of this whole section, this whole story at least, in Mark chapter 5, I guess the section beginning in verse 21 and going to the end of the chapter. The main theme really ends up being, when we look at the organization with this sandwich that we have in those verses, Jairus' need to overcome fear and instead to embrace faith. That's exactly what Jesus tells him to do in verse 36, and that seems to be sort of the keystone for this whole passage. Do not be afraid, only believe. That's what he needs to do. The tense, of course, as we talked about, he's telling Jairus and he's telling us, keep believing. There's the persistency that's implied in the verb tense that's used there. Keep believing, keep having faith, keep hanging on. And really that is the difference. It's maybe a slight difference because I don't want to shortchange Jairus. He obviously has some kind of confidence in Jesus in the first place to come to him, right? But the key difference overall between Jairus and the woman that is healed by touching the hem of Jesus' garment, she is defined completely by that. Her faith isn't pictured as wavering, or she has to have some reminder or some encouragement, keep believing. She's there. That's who she is. She's really explained fully as a human by her faith in Jesus' power. And that's what Jairus needs to do. That really becomes the main point of this whole section as far as he is concerned. Keep believing. You get where she is, and you get comfortable there, and you stay there with that belief, that same confidence in Jesus. That's what carries us through the interval and all of that period of distress and anxiety and hand-wringing over what is going to happen to my child. What gets you from point A to point B, from the sickness until the resurrection, is don't be afraid, only believe. And so Jairus needs that. He needs the faith that this unnamed woman has. But we notice, as we talked about at the very end of class last week, I would submit that when Jesus says that in verse 36, and this will play into some of what we see in chapter 6 as well, but I would submit that in verse 36, Jesus is not talking about his healing or raising of his daughter at all when he says to Jairus, don't be afraid, only believe. I don't take that as the conditions for him working the miracle he's about to work. This does not seem to be in reference to that. It appears as though Jesus' mind is made up. He knows what is going to happen. He knows what he's going to do. The decision is made as it pertains to Jairus' daughter. He has already, you recall, he ignored the pronouncement when the men came and said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? And Jesus ignored that. He neglected that entirely. He said, okay, don't listen to that, Jairus. You listen to me, okay? Jesus knows what is going to happen. The importance of this, don't be afraid, only believe, isn't so that you will see your daughter live again. although he would need to have some confidence in that fact. But more than that, more importantly than that, he still has a decision to make regarding Jesus. Continue believing in me. Continue not just after you see your daughter received back to life again. Keep believing no matter what. Keep believing in me. So in that sense, Jairus is not yet saved. He has to make up his mind about Jesus. Will it be fear and doubting and despair, or will it be faith? And we've seen those two playing off each other so many times in this kind of expanded section, going back to chapter 4, verse 35. Fear versus faith. Which one are we going to give priority? So Jesus takes in verse 37 Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, the two sons of thunder. This is the first time in Mark's gospel that you have this group mentioned, this little trio, the kind of inner circle that will be there for a few key events in the rest of Jesus' ministry. And he takes only them and comes to the house where we find kind of a chaotic scene, right? Verse 38, comes to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult, and those who wept and wailed loudly. The professional mourners have already been brought in, it seems, and this was a common practice of the time. Probably this will include a flute player. I think several commentaries or teachings of the rabbis mention it's kind of expected. You're shortchanging things. You're not really doing what you should if you don't have at least someone to play the flute after a death. And probably some women who are wailing, some, again, professionals who are involved in this capacity. They've already convened to help the family give full vent to their grief. That seems to be the idea behind that practice. If already someone is creating an atmosphere where it doesn't seem unusual to be crying loudly, to be expressing in a colorful, very, very plain, very bold, audibly loud way. They're venting their grief, or they're kind of making these noises and making this display. Maybe I feel more comfortable shedding those tears as well and offering those same cries at full voice as well, which is very foreign to our experience, I think, as Americans, especially as American men, maybe. We kind of have the Conan idea of he doesn't cry, I will cry for him, and so I'm not going to show any kind of emotion. I'm not going to, let any of that stuff come to the forefront. We recognize, and I think we talked about it when we discussed emotions several months ago, there's value in that. There's value in venting those feelings, and that's what these mourners would be trying to help the family accomplish. But it ends up being a chaotic scene, and so Jesus really sort of rebukes this in verse 39. Why make this commotion and weep? His point in this case is not with the process itself necessarily, but it's inappropriate here because we're not dealing with a dead person. She's not dead, she's asleep. So Mark ends up adding a layer of comparison because the mourners, the people who are there making this commotion at the scene, if they are professionals, which the context and the practice of the time seems to point in that way. They're realists. They're pragmatists. They're the experts on death. This is something that they do often. They know a dead person when they see one, right? And their natural response is to ridicule someone who blithely, naively asserts any different diagnosis here. And that's exactly what happens in verse 40. They ridicule, and they're going to laugh Jesus out of the room when he's here talking about she's not dead. You're going to tell me this person isn't dead? Come on. I think I know what I'm talking about, buddy. And so they respond with kind of a scoff. As it happens, Jesus is far more of an expert in this matter. Mark reproduces when Jesus comes into the room in verse 41, takes the child by the hand, and for whatever reason, Mark reproduces and keeps intact the Aramaic statement. Talitha cum is what he tells her. Little girl, I say to you, arise. He translates for us. I don't know why he left that untranslated. It's one of a couple of times in Scripture where you have Aramaic in the New Testament, that is. This is not common at all. And again, I don't really know of an added significance to those words that Mark feels in first putting it in the original language, because he is going to tell us exactly what it says afterward. And with all of these other statements of Jesus, they are translated into Greek. Again, I can only offer possibilities. My feeling is, kind of the way I think about it, what Mark's thought process in doing that. As we've talked about, he's probably leaning a lot on Peter's recall of what is happening here. A lot of the details in Mark's gospel point towards some knowledge gained from Peter being there, being in the room. It sort of takes on his perspective. You can imagine this simple two-word declaration in scope of what is about to happen here. Jesus is coming into a room with a dead person, and with these two simple words, somehow powerful enough to pillage Sheol, to go into the grave and reclaim someone back. With just those two words, you can imagine them being seared into the minds of those who are there. It's not a magical phrase, it's not an incantation, it's just a simple command. But it's a simple command from one with power over living and dead alike. And there is something about just, again, you can imagine those words haunting in a good way, haunting the memory of anyone who was there to hear them, and just be awed with the power, be overcome with the power of this man speaking two simple words, and having this girl immediately, in verse 42, arise and walk. This overcomes them with great amazement, predictably. Rest of the record is as we would expect. The family and the others respond with that characteristic, that predictable amazement to one of Jesus' miracles. Jesus likewise acts in his characteristic way. He gives the moratorium on spreading the word. Don't say anything to anyone. Don't go and tell everybody about what has happened. He strictly commanded them that no one should know it. He's back to this practice that he seems to relax for a little bit with Legion, with a man possessed by Legion for a moment. But things kind of get back to normal in this case. Don't tell anybody, and keep living your lives as you were. But remember what has happened here. They're amazed, of course. Comments, questions, anything to mention or to address here with this final part of chapter 5? Steve, go ahead.
So it's similar in a way, but it has some differences. When Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead,
Yeah.
he initially said, he's not dead, he's asleep. And then he later clarified to the people because they didn't get it. He said plainly,
Yeah.
she's dead.
Yeah. Lazarus is dead.
The statement is, she's not dead, and
Yeah.
has not died. It seems like an unusual twist there.
Yeah.
Where in one case he admits it, in the other case he doesn't.
Yeah. And it is, that statement in verse 39, of course, people have tried to kind of play with that and make it, well, okay, so maybe she wasn't actually dead. She was just sick, and he came in at the right time and, said something, and she revived after that. Clearly, Mark is telling us, no, she was. Jesus is just talking about it in a different way. But it is interesting for him to discuss it in such a, I don't know, almost a stubborn way. It almost feels as though he's being stubborn or argumentative because we'd say, well, I mean, you know what they're talking about when they say she's dead. She is, literally, medically, whatever, she is. Jesus is right, too, in that she's not going to remain dead. From the fact that she's soon going to be alive, you would say, no, it's only asleep. It's only very temporary. But we clearly know what they mean when they go, yeah, but she's dead. So he's more setting up the anticipation of what he's going to do. But it is interesting the way he talks about it. Yeah, Heather. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. You've got a lot of people who are going to know something happened. idea seems to be based on that one, we don't spread it beyond where it has to go. I mean, you got some witnesses that you're not going to be able to do anything about. So you don't tell anyone that doesn't already know what's going on. Don't go into the next village and start preaching it there. Don't make a big production out of telling everyone the specifics of what has happened here. That seems to go along in part with the fact that he only brings this small group of people into the house with him and into the room with him. Just those 6 people end up being there, Jesus and his 3 disciples, the girl and her parents. So, as we've talked about with all of those instances, it's in some ways kind of a strange command to give to people, to not say anything about this. For one, when his goal is to have people hear him and know what he has done, that he's intentionally going to limit the spread of that message. And we've talked about some of the reasons why that might be. But 2, when you do just have so many accounts that are going to be like, well, you got to tell me something. Try to picture what the next day is going to be like at the market with these parents if somebody comes up and asks them, boy, I heard something really bad happen with your daughter. I mean, we're glad everything seems to be going well. What happened? What do you say? You go, oh, well, nothing. That's not going to work. That's not going to fly. You got to tell them something. So, I don't really know what those conversations would have been like. Mark's emphasis all throughout this seems to be, and I know I'm kind of a record on this idea, all the way up until chapter 8, we just keep getting this idea of keep it secret, for lack of a better word. It is going to be a secret, exactly who he is. It's that messianic secret that is often talked about. In chapter 8, it burst through all the way. You are the Christ. You're the Son of the living God. Then we know. Then the disciples know. Then everybody else is going to know. But for right now, as much as is possible, we're saying, I don't want you to know. Not in those words, at least. You put the pieces together. You understand from what I'm telling you what's going on. But we're going to kind of keep a lid on this and keep things controlled almost. So it's a good point or a good question that I don't know I can fully answer to. Joni? Yes. Yeah. 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 That one exception with the formerly possessed man in verse 18, Joni is talking about, seems largely to be because of we're in a predominantly Gentile region where Jesus is about to have to leave prematurely. Him talking about what Jesus has done or about what the Lord has done and revealing all that will not be freighted with the same preconceptions and misconceptions that it would be if someone were to do the same in Jerusalem, for instance. And Jesus, for the time at least, in the territory of the Gerasenes or wherever he is, his time there is limited for now. And so this man can maybe go kind of pave the way. In a sense, he's sort of the first apostle to the Gentiles and is going to be able to go and start telling some people what Jesus has done there. And so that makes him a little bit different than these other cases too. I think those largely would tell us why we have different treatment there. Ian? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we mentioned last week too, especially here in this last section, starting in verse 21. Both of them talk in rescue language. They both use the word for salvation, Jairus and the woman as well. When they come to Jesus, they're saying to him, "Rescue me, save me." They're literally asking for salvation, or expressing their faith that they will have salvation, especially in the case of the bleeding woman. So yes, those two tied together inextricably, and that is what Jesus offers. That is the greater point that is being made here. As a kind of aside or in passing, we might wonder, when you read the end of chapter 5 here, one might wonder, and often do voice this question, I guess, why so few resurrections in the Gospels? If Jesus is as capable of doing it so simply as it appears here, just walk into the room, tell her to get up, and that's what happens, why was anybody dying during those 3 years that Jesus was here on earth? Why do we only read of these very select few? We can all call to mind the account of Lazarus and the name of Lazarus, of this man who's being raised, partly because that just doesn't happen every day. There's just these few who have that given to them. We might have little answer to that other than to remember that the signs of Jesus, and that's how the Bible refers to them, he did these signs, they are just that. What is a sign? When you see the road sign that says Dallas 40 miles, that's not telling you that's Dallas where this sign is. That's saying it's this way and it's this far away, and you do this to get there. You follow the sign. It points you in a direction. It's not the destination. Jesus, no matter what he did or what happened while he was among us, life before and during and after his time here was marked by men and women and children living and dying. That's real life on this earth. The key distinction is, that Mark reveals for us in the finality, of course, Jesus came to offer his own death so that a more lasting resurrection can be available to all. So his power here is merely pointing us towards the greater hope that says, here's what he's capable of. Here's what he is going to do for all those who do not fear but believe. And without upsetting the entire balance of humanity as it exists and has existed for the entirety of time, to say, well, nobody's going to die anymore while we're here on earth. That would be kind of starting the program early, wouldn't it? There will be that time when death is defeated and when death is abolished, but the Lord is forestalling that time, giving men a chance to repent. That's the time where we find ourselves right now. But remember, I guess, that this is simply a sign pointing us towards a greater reality. Steve?
For me, the performance of miracles is one of the greatest proof of the deity of Jesus.
Oh, sure.
Totally inexplicable by science or logic or anything like that. So, down the road, Nicodemus comes to say, we know that you're from God because nobody can do these things that you do.
Yeah.
But the others didn't get it.
Yeah. And to that point, maybe a nice segue into chapter 6. Not everyone does get it, do they? And that includes some of the people that have the least excuse for not believing. In chapter 6, this passage really, these first 6 verses of chapter 6, let's move on to them. They really conclude the section that started all the way back there in chapter 4, verse 35. Remember, we've been seeing some miracles of Jesus, which at times elicited great faith, even when Jesus was in some foreign or unclean or hostile environments. He is on a storm-tossed sea, or he's in a region of Gentile pig farmers where demons are running rampant in the countryside. So in these very hostile circumstances, Jesus works great miracles, and he finds great faith. Now, in chapter 6, Jesus has returned home. He is back in Nazareth. He will find no faith, and as a result, he will offer few miracles. It's also, this first section in chapter 6, also sort of a bridge into the next section, verses 7 through 29, where we find the role of prophets and disciples dealt with, including the costs that might be paid. So Jesus returns to his own country, Mark tells us. He doesn't name it here as Nazareth, but he had told us back in chapter 1 and verse 9. He was Jesus of Nazareth, and that's how he's referred to in verse 24 of that same first chapter. So he has gone home to Nazareth. Nazareth is a tiny town. It's unremarkable. It's almost entirely insignificant. It is almost completely unknown to ancient writers. You don't find it in surviving histories. You don't find it in things that were written at the time or before that time. If it was not the place where Jesus was raised, no one would know what it is now. No one would care what Nazareth is now. It's a town at the time of about 200 to 500 people. Might have included a decently sized Gentile population. It is in Galilee, and that's sort of what we might expect from some of these towns. Not a majority, but maybe a sizable minority. Jesus teaching in their synagogue, which he's going to do, beginning in verse 2, that's entirely usual. Guest speakers would often come and speak or teach, have a benediction of some kind they might offer at a Sabbath meeting. The only surprise might be that Jesus is invited to do so after the fear shown earlier by his family. You remember at the close of chapter 3, what was his family thinking? They wanted to bring him back here to Nazareth. Why? They think he might be going out of his mind. They think he's beside himself. He's losing grip of reality in some way. Maybe this is just an episode, or maybe something serious is really going on. But they were worried that he was not all there mentally and wanted to bring him back so that they could keep him safe, is the sense that Mark had given us. So with that being the case, and you know, we can't say with certainty how much was known in Nazareth about him and his teaching and his following prior to this point, that might make it kind of surprising, I guess, that Jesus is still given the opportunity to speak here at the synagogue. But in general, this is not something we should find to be surprising. You would normally have a guest speaker from out of town or someone coming back home to town. That's in line with what we would expect in a synagogue. But Mark records the reaction of this hometown crowd in a series of questions. Some of them or all of them rhetorical, starting there in verse 2. Many hearing him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? And what wisdom is this which is given to him, that such mighty works are performed by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? And aren't his sisters here with us?" He first mentions their astonishment, as we saw, and as Mark commonly does, and he concludes by saying in verse 3 that they were offended by him. And we'll have more to say about that in a moment. So maybe they were at first amazed in a kind of more positive sense, you know, that they react favorably to the wisdom and the miracles he showed, and only later descended into distrust or offense. But really the general tenor of this whole passage is of a negative reception, probably right from the outset. It does not seem as though when he's talking about them being astonished in verse 2 and when they're talking about the miracles and everything, that this is a positive thing where they're impressed and they're saying, "Wow, this is cool. Wow, you know, I gotta go tell some other people about this because I really can't believe this is happening. What an amazing thing." It seems negative from the outset. Consider some of those specific questions. In verse 2, the leadoff question is really where? Where did he get this from? But this isn't asking from where in good faith. And we say that simply because they don't make any effort to determine the meaning of a known local who shows supernatural wisdom and power. This doesn't feel like a question that's actually asked for information. Here's Jesus, we've known him his whole life. Now he's coming back and he's healing people who have grave illnesses. We've heard about him raising people from the dead, casting out demons, doing all sorts of stuff that I can't do. Can you do that? No, I can't do that. It's not something in the water in Nazareth. None of us can do this. Where's he getting that from? But this isn't actually causing them to say, well, let's think about this. Let's apply some logic. If he's capable of doing that, what's the source of this? Can we work through the implications of the only possible source for what they clearly witness as divine power? Instead, the question has an unspoken answer. When they say, where did this man get these things? The unspoken answer, the implied answer, is given in a kind of scoffing tone, a kind of miffed tone, not from around here. He didn't get this from Nazareth, because we know who he is and we know where he's from. Where did all of this come from? They know perfectly well where they live and what is expected from Nazarenes, which is not much. The question you'll find in John's gospel from Nathanael. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Let's be honest. His friend tells him, I met the Messiah. Jesus from Nazareth. Oh, okay. Yeah, I bet he is. I bet that's the Messiah. From Nazareth, you say? Good one. No, nobody does anything notable or good or useful in or from Nazareth. As a result, and again, they know this very well. They know the reputation their town has. The focus on where is a way of minimizing and dismissing him. Follow the logic there. A, nothing from Nazareth would prepare someone to speak or act authoritatively. B, Jesus is from Nazareth. So, C, he can't really be doing anything extraordinary because we know where he's from. We know who he is. And that stuff just doesn't happen here. It reads almost as if they're accusing him of being a fraud, a pretender, trying to outgrow and outdo his humble roots. Where'd all this come from, Jesus? We know it's not you. We know that's not really who you are and where you've come from. Then the townspeople focus on his more personal identity, his work and his family. Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and these four guys' brother, and we know his sisters as well? He hasn't been trained by a rabbi. He's the carpenter. This, in that day, would be sort of like me proclaiming myself as an expert in a field, and I don't have a degree in that field. I come to somebody and I say, I'm an economist, and I'm going to tell you what we should be doing. And they say, oh, okay, well, where did you study? And I go, I didn't study. But, I'm telling you, I stayed at a Holiday Inn last night, as the commercial goes. Like that, it's that kind of saying, okay, he's a carpenter. Why is he telling us about the Torah? Why is he telling us about the Scriptures? He's only a laborer. That doesn't have a negative connotation for Jews. They have a healthy respect for manual work, but it doesn't explain his education. It doesn't explain any of this, as they say it in verse 2, this wisdom that is given to him. I didn't come from swinging a hammer. I didn't come from, making a set of stairs or whatever this man's been doing. So, again, from where? Beyond that, Jesus makes no appeals to more well-known teachers. He's getting this wisdom from somewhere, and he's not telling us from where. Matthew, of course, in the Sermon on the Mount, focuses on the authority that Jesus speaks with, and that's always brought up in those lengthy sets of teaching. What wisdom is this, they ask? His former life, known to the people he now taught, can't explain his ability, can't explain his confidence. And they do know his family well. That's where their questions then really tend to shift. He's Mary's son. Briefly, let me mention a little bit about that, because that is a point of observation, I guess, that he's described as the son of Mary, that he's given a matronym, that he's spoken of as his mother's son, because that is kind of unusual in the Jewish culture of the day. Normally you'd say he's his father's son, he's Joseph's son. That's much, much more common. And so there might be a few reasons for that. Could be a reference to, I guess the most common answer is to say, well, this probably tells us Joseph was dead by this point. And that could be the case. You read John 6:42 speaks of him sounding as though he's a person who's still alive. And John 6 isn't definitive too. The way they talk about him in John could be the way you would talk about a dead person that you did know, but they say there, we know Joseph. So, is Joseph alive or dead? I don't know. I wouldn't say strongly one way or another. The old tradition that is now very heavily influenced by Roman Catholic theology is that since we know Jesus has all these brothers, and since we know Mary remained a virgin her entire life, well, those 4 boys and those sisters must have come from somewhere, and it wasn't from Mary. So I guess those were Joseph's. He must have had a wife previously. And so these are step or half siblings to Jesus. And so when they call Jesus Mary's son, it's because that's how you'd be known if these people all have different mothers. Again, there's nothing biblically to support this. In fact, to the contrary, all the indications are that these are flesh and blood brothers of Jesus. No indication other than that. Without making too much of it, I'll just note that their use of that is unusual. It's not unheard of, but it's unusual for first century Jews. There's the possibility, based on some other examples, that it could be seen as insulting. That's not a given, it's just a possibility. And it could hint at questions about the legitimacy of Jesus' birth, which ends up, of course, being the position taken by later Judaism and by all skepticism afterward. Mary didn't have a virgin birth. Mary was a young girl who got pregnant out of wedlock and told somebody that that's what happened to her, that God impregnated her. But no, this is just what happened, and she kind of covered that up. Jesus was illegitimate. Again, that isn't really coming out strongly in them saying this. They could have called him the son of Mary for a variety of reasons. I mention it simply as a possibility. All right, the takeaway as a whole from all of these questions, let's get to the bottom of what they're saying here. They are offended, Mark tells us. The end of verse 3. What does this idea imply? And that's a common Bible word. They were offended at him. What does that mean in a New Testament context when you are offended? Okay, assaults logic or understanding, maybe. Is it the same idea as, people love getting offended today. That means you wore shoes that I didn't like, or you root for a different football team than I do, and I took offense to that. I took that personally. No, this is very different from the way we use offense or taking offense to something. No, it's really not even the idea of being embarrassed. Maybe closer to that than something else. Really, the Greek word is scandalize, and that's just scandal is a transliteration of the word that we find here. They're scandalized by this, but that even we use differently today. Really, the upshot of what he's saying here is, and in all of the places where it's used likewise, they're made to stumble. And Mark uses it 8 times in his gospel, and again, you find it a lot throughout the New Testament. But when you read, for instance, when Jesus discusses later on in chapter 9, he's talking about, whoever makes one of these little ones who believes in me, whoever makes one of them to sin, it'd be better if he'd never been born, or if he'd drowned in the sea or something like that. Make them sin, make them stumble. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your hand scandalizes you, if your eye scandalizes you, if you scandalize one of these little ones who believe in me, it'd be better if you were never born. That's what he's saying. Peter, all will be made to stumble because of you, Lord, but I won't. I will never be scandalized, is what he's saying there. It always has the idea of one who is incited to sin, one who is made to stumble or to fall. So that's what Mark is telling us in this case. They were offended at him. They stumbled at who Jesus was and what he was doing. Scandalizing weakens or destroys belief. That's what's happening. That's clearly what has happened in Nazareth. They don't believe when Jesus shows up. Well, the question we naturally ask then, why? What's the scandal? What has he possibly done that makes them offended at him so that they don't believe? In short, and as we've sort of skirted around it, it's because they know Jesus too well. He's too ordinary, he's too human, he's too familiar. Remember that here we are in the first century, way before Horatio Alger, right? This is way before the American dream, rags to riches, young boy starts with nothing and ends up making something good of himself and all these sorts of things. This is long before the American dream, and they live in a time and place where men don't, and really men shouldn't, stray too far from their origins. If you're born the carpenter's son in Nazareth, then you're eventually just going to be the carpenter's dad in Nazareth, and your family's going to keep doing that in this same place, in this same social strata for the rest of the history of your bloodline. You don't need to do anything beyond that. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's not act out. A Nazareth boy acting like an authority, in their eyes, is some puffed up con man trying to put on airs. And they can't accept that. They can't accept that the kingdom starts as a mustard seed, which is how Jesus phrased it back in chapter 4 and verse 30, isn't it? It starts small, men wouldn't think anything of it, but it becomes something great. They're just seeing a mustard seed. They're seeing this man who has no reason to be talking as he's talking and doing as he is doing. They know him too well. They can't believe it of him. Now, there's horrible irony here, isn't there? Think back to what has come before, and now what's happening here. When God came to the people who knew him best, who were familiar with him, they didn't believe because of that familiarity. All right, what happens in the other scenarios? He shows mankind the terrifying and totally foreign power of divinity that they can't understand, that they are not familiar with at all. And what happens to most of them? They don't like that either. They don't believe that either. They're just afraid. They just say, get out of our town because we don't know who you are, what you are, how you've got the power to do this, and I don't like it and I don't want to think about it. Move to the next town, please. So they reject him for one, they reject him for the other. It's like he'll say later, John came doing something and you got mad at him. I came doing the exact opposite and you got mad at me. You guys aren't going to be happy with anything. And it's sort of the same idea here playing out in this same general section. Obviously, it's not uniform, and there's the sort of mystery of faith in that, where unexpected people have unexpected responses. The disciples vacillate. They kind of go all over. You have a demoniac Gentile who believes. You have Jesus' own people who reject him. But then again, you have Gentiles who also crucify him. And you have his brother James, who eventually comes to belief and is one of the pillars of the early church. We never know for sure how one will react. It's a certainty, though, and what Jesus will be pointing out here shortly in verse 4, it is a certainty that close proximity in a physical sense does nothing to guarantee faith. And he's already made this point back in chapter 3. That leads us to kind of some irony as well with even their question in verse 3. Aren't his sisters here with us, they say? If we read the last 5 verses from chapter 3, we're forced to kind of answer, no, they're not. His sisters aren't here with you. His sisters are with him. Because as Jesus had said, who are my mother and my brothers and my sisters? Those who do the will of God. Those who listen to the Lord. So they're with him, no matter where they came from originally. Grow up where you want, know him for as long as you want as a physical human being. That doesn't do anything as far as belief is concerned. You're going to have to accept it based on who he truly is and your recognition of those facts. So as Jesus narrows the scope there in verse 4, prophet is not without honor except in his own country, in his own relatives, in his own house. Make that circle as small as you wish physically. It doesn't guarantee that inside status. If you don't believe him, you're still on the outside of the house looking in. And so the question keeps coming up regarding his identity. Who is he? Who is he? That's a theme by now in Mark, and the demons always answer with the truth. Nazareth at large still has that truth elude their grasp. They're blinded by a hometown prejudice. And we'll see the outcome of that next week, because we're going to have to stop for now. Thank you very much. Really do appreciate your time tonight. We'll pick up around verse 4 next week here in chapter 6. Thanks so much.